Just briefly, I've been thinking the last few days about how do you acknowledge territory in a virtual environment, right? We're kind of all over the place. So I was thinking about maybe the way to kind of ground that is to think about the kind of disfiguring and contamination of 500 years of colonization in terms of how we even think about territory, how we even think about come to know the land beneath our feet, and the kind of uncomfortable ways that that's related to discourses of development that we'll be talking about today. So certainly where I'm based in Mi'kma'ki, which is on the eastern coast of what we call in colonial language Canada, there are treaties like the 1725 Treaty of Peace and Friendship. Riva is in the same country, and Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe territory. And I don't want to dwell specifically on the individual treaties at the risk of some controversy. And the only reason why is because when we talk about these treaties, it always references Europe or Eurocentric thinking right at the beginning. And what that does is it displaces, what Anishinaabe conceptions of land are, what Mi'kmaq conceptions of land are. So the way I want to acknowledge the land and territory today is to talk a little bit about what the solidarity looks like, the anti-colonial solidarity looks like, as it relates to Black Lives Matter here in Mi'kma'ki. And, the African Nova Scotian population here is 400 years running. And the levels of solidarity, there have always been opportunities that have sometimes been missed, and increasingly so in the 21st century is almost never missed. When Black lives are being threatened, it's Mi'kmaq people and Mi'kmaq activists who are the first to come out. When Indigenous sovereignty is being threatened, it's the Black community here in Mi'kma'ki that's the first to come out. And that's a level of connectivity and anti-colonial solidarity that I think in some ways gets us closer to rediscovering what these solidarities can look like in terms of making the land into something that it wasn't quote unquote developed into. So I'll leave the land acknowledgement there and pass it to Riva.
Welcome to our panelists, and welcome to all attendees who have joined us. Thank you for being here. So just to start off to our panelists, maybe you can provide us like a little bit of a background of global development and what the field looks like as a scholarship to all our speakers, please.
Okay, good evening everyone. Now, here I am, it's evening, so talking to you from South Africa. Thank you so much for having me. I was looking forward to this conversation. So for me, the field of global development, I even find it difficult to define it, as in to go beyond the description, right? Because one way to do it is just open most of international development syllabi or handbook, textbooks, and we get a sense of what it's about. I could point at the mainstream version of that, which usually will take us to have that story start somewhere around American President Truman in 49, deciding that let's be nice to the rest of the world, whatever. I'm simplifying a little bit, but I think that's one aspect in which we can try and understand global development as a type of industry of international, which actually means north-south mostly, conceptions of aid and development, right? And I think a lot of the courses that we offer at the university level are somehow in there. So again, another way could be to ask 18-year-olds, why would they choose that as a degree? It's often to go and work for an NGO or the UN or any of these things, right? So that's one way to describe it. And that's the part of global development that I find extremely problematic. And when I try to advocate for let's literally abolish it, it's that. And then another way to approach it is to just look at the idea of development. And if we take the example of how Walter Rodney tried to make sense of it in his How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, it's a much more generic way of trying to address people's attempts to thrive according to the environment in which they live. And that doesn't require necessarily a colonial history or anything that comes with that, but it doesn't also require a North-South relation. And it's literally almost the same as saying how live well. And then, and then we can have a whole philosophical and other debates on how we go about that. And then thirdly, so that one, I think there's such a vast field of generative thinking that is out that we could do around it, right? And when I say I try to study anti-colonial solidarity, I would place it in there in a sense that people's possibility of thinking of their own good life has been thwarted very severely by the colonial past and the colonial present. So that's where I would locate that. So the third thing that I would say very briefly, and it's mostly in the context of us coming together as GDS section of the ISA, is the section that is literally called Global Development section, and the people that it brings together. And I think actually in the beginning, I remember thinking, oh, let's make sure we get rid of this name because, I will connect it much more to the first discussion that I said. But then if you see the people and what they're working around, the ethos that brings us together, a lot of it is post and decolonial, anti-colonial. I would say this is a place that has challenged myself to think in terms of what's in a name and how do we work around that, right? So those would be my three ways of approaching what global development could mean in the present day. So we have the mainstream, we have the open field of living well, and then we have the concrete instances like this, the institutional instances as well, where we try to make sense probably of negotiating both, like the GDS section. I'll leave it there.
Am I answering the same question? Okay.
Yes, you are.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that Olivia did a really great job, and I agree with basically everything that she said. And it also helped me better think about how I describe the field, right? And so it is as an intellectual space, it is extremely messy, right? As most intellectual spaces are in the academy. But I think one of the things I use to help me in teaching about the field of global development studies to students is to think about origin, right? And so as Olivia said, one origin being, especially from the post-development scholarship, is situating the project, right, or the kind of development enterprises starting with Truman, right, and the doctrine towards the rest of the people of the world, as Gustavo Esteva says, right, like overnight becoming underdeveloped subjects. Then you can also think about it as with its origins in the kind of post-colonial thread that suggests that development is just a continuation of colonialism, right? It has the same kind of matrices of power, which is kind of what I use in my own work to think about development as having a kind of longer durée beyond just the development enterprise that we see today. I think we might all agree that the dominant language in the field, though, sees development as starting in Europe, right, as these kinds of, this modernization process, right, that happens at various levels from the stages of capitalist development to development towards liberal democracy and individualism, right? And so the whole kind of modernizing project that situates itself in Europe and then follows by taking the rest of the world and using it analogously, right, with the kind of stages that happen in Europe as being the project of development, right? So whenever I think about it and all of its messiness, because then of course, as some of you have also kind of mentioned, there's the project of indigeneity that's becoming more prevalent in the field of global development studies, right? And that's especially evident in the decolonial literature, right? That's gaining a lot of traction, right, in the academy, starting first with decolonizing the academy, but then of course there being a considerable overlap with how then do we decolonize development, right? And that praxis on the ground. So I see the field as having various strands that are messy, but one way to help us locate our own relationship with those strands is to think about origin, right?
Thank you for that. And that kind of connects to the theme of this topic, which is Black Lives Matter and global development. So if you can both just touch upon how you see the relationship between Black Lives Matter and global development.
So to answer that question, I think we can think in terms of Black Lives Matters as a kind of particular movement, right, at this time, or we can situate it in a kind of longer historical context, right, when we start to think about what do we mean by Black Lives Matters. So we can understand it in its as an acephalous movement, right, that formed in 2013 by 3 Black women in response to this long-standing tradition of public lynchings and state-sanctioned murder of Black and brown men and women, right? And then all of those things kind of culminating in the legal decision to exonerate Trayvon Martin's killer, right? So we can think of it as this current social movement, or I think we can also understand Black Lives Matters as a kind of longer demand to recognize the contribution and value of Black bodies, right? That Black bodies have made in many instances against their own volition to the formations of capitalism, liberal democracy, and cultural freedom at the national and international level, right? And then I think similarly back to, as we were talking about how there are so many ways we can think about global development, right? If we talk about the relationship between Black Lives Matters and the dominant form of global development, right? What's kind of been hegemonic in the field, which I conceive of it as this kind of contrived push of humanity towards convergence around capitalism, liberal democracy, and individuality as a normatively desirable end. Well, then we can see the relationship between global development studies and Black Lives Matters as having been fraught from its very inception, right? Filled with contradictions, successes, setbacks, resolutions. And I'm thinking especially about the role that historically that at times African Americans have played in furthering American imperialism and civilizing missions on the continent, right? But also simultaneously through the work of scholars like W.E.B. Du Bois and Pan-African Congresses, challenging those same types of civilizing missions and imperialism. Then we can see how it's not a very linear or singular narrative, right, in talking about that relationship. But what does remain constant, though, is the erasure of Black Americans and their contributions to and negations of global development, right, as a field.
Yeah, I'm just gonna build on that and maybe also come back to the distinction I made before between the dominant understanding of global development and then the other one where we just think about life and the possibility of life. Let me summarize it like that. So in the first instance, I would say that Black Lives Matters. No, in the first instance, I would say actually that global development is an extension of the extent to which Black lives do not matter, let's say in a US context. So in a domestic context, but I could make the same claim of domestic context in Europe, let's say. Because if we recognize, like Takiyah was saying, that that mainstream version of global development is actually a continuation of a colonial system of governance, then historically the connection between when did Black lives stop mattering so systematically, incessantly, is the connection between the transatlantic slave trade, the genocide of the indigenous peoples in Americas first, and then the colonization of the different territories globally. So we can place people of African descent in a particular context in there because I do think it allows us to understand the disposability of certain lives in a very, very precise way. But I would never make it an exclusive thing, as in something that only has happened to people of African descent. So in that sense, I would say the connection, to put it very sharply, but the connection between global international development and Black Lives Matters is that we need to recognize that international development, even though it preaches the exact opposite, is a system of governance that continues to have Black lives not matter. And I'm sure we can discuss that. But that's I think for us the painful thing in the discipline that we have to take more seriously. And when we say international development or global development, I place that within the context of international relations, for instance, but I think most of the humanities, very few of our humanities would escape that charge. And then I would say the opposite or the flip side of this argument would be that if we take development to mean the possibility of life and all the knowledges that we can create around it to actually foster that, then I think that the slogan of Black Lives Matters is one of the prerequisites to answer that question in the present in a way that is going to be generative. Because if we focus on how systematically the destruction of Black life is unfolding, both what we call domestically, internationally, but also very much on the African continent at the moment, if we take that as a starting point to try and think about the possibility of life in abundance, that does not mean capitalist accumulation and any of these things, right? Then I think that epistemologically, there's a lot to understand from the imperative of Black life should matter, if we were to start that. So that's how I would make the connection between the two. In the first understanding, they are in extreme opposition to each other. But if we rework our understanding of what development could be about, then without paying attention to the extent to which Black lives do or do not matter, that will help us understand the possibility of development, if that's in any way clear. But that's how I've been trying to straddle it, yeah.
Yeah, and that kind of builds on the next question that we have in mind, which is, to what extent have Black lives mattered or not mattered historically in the discourse of international and global development? So if you can just kind of elaborate a little bit more on that, and Olivia, you can go with that, please.
So I think from what I said, it's clear that I do think that global development, and let's say the different revolutions, industrial revolutions, the growth of global racial capitalism, let's say, in the last 400 years, is the story of Black lives not mattering. That's the most simple and most painful way to say it. So then, and again, I think the really difficulty by trying to answer that question in the context of global development is that it's as a discipline or approach or a discourse or an industry or institutions that are built around it, it says that it's doing the exact opposite. So to pierce that, we come back to what Takiyah was saying in terms of erasure. So there's a lot of white innocence that, navigates that as well. But it's also a lot very much trying to hold on to a particular status quo, and especially the discourse of international development and aid and generosity and all of these things that do not make sense after a history of mass killings and exploitation, any of these things. We can't really use that language of aid, but it's very much at the heart of global development. So I would say in that sense, it's an example that Black lives have not mattered. And what I have found useful to try and make sense of that as a discipline is, for instance, the work by Julia Suarez-Kraber, where she builds on insights from Zapatista movement, but also other indigenous communities in the Americas, where rather than talking about human rights or development or the different ways in which we portray this, she borrows the language of the Death Project. So the arrival of the Europeans, which was always a double project of preaching civilizationism and everything that comes with that. And I think development aid is a huge part of that. And then obviously all the horrors and genocides, epistemicide, ecocides that came with that. So she says, rather than talk about development or human rights systems and everything, what happens if we call it the Death Project? And it's not just about simplifying everything in terms of bad intentions and, evil people coming and whatever, but it's actually, again, fundamentally shifting the locus of enunciation or the epistemic standpoint from which you try to answer any of the questions that we talked to today, if we send to Black people, if we send to Indigenous people, then we actually don't even need to spend that much time in explaining how bad global development is, like literally. But still, we could build a whole career on just deconstructing the whole thing, because the discourse around it is so powerfully shaped around goodwill, generosity, aid, collaboration. We call it partnership. We call it all the different beautiful words, right? So that's why I'm so wedded sometimes to try and shift from whose position are we trying to answer in these questions. And the moment that we decenter the Eurocentric or white experience or understanding of the world, most of what we teach literally doesn't make sense. It's actually as simple. It literally doesn't make sense. But still, it's taken me, for instance, 20 years to come to a point where I can just easily say that without, you know, so yeah, that's how I would develop this.
Yeah, I think that's very much in line in some some perhaps not direct way with how I would answer that question, right? So I would say that Black lives have always mattered to global development scholarship to the extent that their oppressors are ostensibly perceived as non-white, right? And what I mean by that is, right, for example, if we look at Africa, right, as the quote unquote Black continent, and the way in which it shows up in development discourse and the development discipline as a site of perpetual resistance to modern development, right? It's people held captive by avaricious authoritarians, ethnic allegiances, atavistic institutions. Well, then we have what Melinda Smith calls, you know, the African tragedy, right? Or what Sibra Gravogi explains as in Africa becoming Black, it becomes code for international dysfunction, right? And so in the discipline, I think that Blackness has always mattered to the extent that it is reified and supported, right, the whiteness and the white savior complex, right, that is very much part and parcel with global development studies, right, in its dominant form. But to the extent that Black lives exist as a stark reminder of how whiteness orders access to resources, how it shapes political institutions, and how it manifests as domestic terrorism, well, then those places always exist beyond the purview of global development studies, right? And so to Olivia's point, right, if we think about racial capitalism, right, and this like longer history and the way that it very much undergirds a lot of what we think about dominant global development studies, well then Black bodies and racialized bodies have always been essential to that process, but as disposable labor, right, as disposable bodies, right? And so in being disposable, they've been able to be kind of erased from the discussion as valuable, right? And again, to the extent that we're not, I think, especially development scholars, and I'm always weary, right, of like the white American scholars who focus so much on the problems of Africa, right, but don't ever turn inwards to look at the problems in the US, right? Which is this really funny way in which the US has become centered in development studies as not as a place that requires development and aid, but as a site of intellectual production about development, right? Which is this really weird position, because we know that the US, especially when you disaggregate by race, has numbers that are equivalent to what we see on the continent and what we see in the so-called third world and global south. But as a discipline, development studies has rarely, if ever, turned on itself, right, to examine and situate the US within the context of a geopolitical space that requires examination and push or a concerted effort around its commitments to development, right, especially as it relates to the way in which it has racialized and reproduced racial capitalism in order for it to kind of achieve its dominant status, right, as at the top of like the hierarchy of global development, right? And so I always think that it's, especially in my own work, right, like as a Black American woman and comparing the US with Senegal and Ghana, right, like that methodological move is very intentional to show that the US should very much be included in all forms, all threads of global development studies, right? It requires examination, it requires pushback, it requires a complete kind of unbraiding of the myth that surrounds the US as the site of knowledge production around development, and less the site of required intervention, if that makes sense.
Thank you. I mean, those are very well-developed answers, and it really allows us to see how global development functions and does not function. So that kind of, to build off those answers, I want us to think about, and you can elaborate on these questions, what have Black people and their communities done to make development about them?
Yeah, so I have a bunch of examples, of course, of things that Black people have done to basically to fill in the spaces where the state has perpetually failed us, right? Especially in the US. And also, I think it's important to apply that to the continent as well, right? Where the assumption is that where the state and market have failed different African communities, donors and NGOs have stepped in to provide those services without actually acknowledging how different configurations of African communities have done that work as well, right? So in the US context, one example I want to talk about is tied to some of my own kind of local work I've been doing. And there's an African American community not far from Davidson called Smithville, right? And it's a community of African Americans that date back to the end of slavery, right? Like the end of the 1800s. And this community is basically a small island within a sea of whiteness, and very conservative whiteness here. As the community was kind of coming to form, they were not provided with any type of public service, right? So in the late, early 1900s, for example, mid 1900s, everyone else was getting sewers, right? Everyone else was getting sewage systems, and they were intentionally left out of that process, right? So the sewage systems almost like intentionally went around this community. They were not given education. They have what we call in the US Rosenwald schools, right? Which were basically these philanthropic schools that were created in African American communities because Black kids were not allowed to go to the state funded and locally funded schools, right? Over time, they were also responsible for putting up their own kind of like light infrastructure, right? So everything that the state was to put, or in the city was supposed to have provided them, they were intentionally left out of it, right? And the state and the city refused to incorporate this community up until I believe like the 1970s, so that they can actually have access to these public services, right? So this is just one kind of example when I was talking about in the beginning about how we can look at this in like a longer history, right? Not just in its current iteration. The other one though is also very recent, and it's around this community organizing that came about at the start of COVID called Jail Support, right? And basically what it is was these community organizations that came together at the start of COVID when they realized that people who were being jailed were not being given face masks, they were not being allowed to socially distance, right? And we know that especially in the US, the majority of people who are in prison, brought into jails are people of color, right? And so it just started with this group organizing and collecting resources from the community just to give to people when they were released from jail, right? So giving them access to phone calls, giving them money to get Ubers, food, water, cigarettes, clothes, all these types of things. And more recently, the Mecklenburg County police officers have actually come into confrontation with this group, right? They've like arrested them, they've intimidated them, they've harassed them, all because they're trying to provide a service that we know the state cannot and will not provide, right? I mean, and this is 100% run off of volunteer support and community support. People who are out there at 4 a.m. every day, just so that when someone is released from jail, they have access to these basic services, right? And so in the US, these are just two examples of kind of this longer history of just the state not providing basic services that you pay your tax money for, right, just to Black communities. But then also the kind of initiatives that come in response to a failure, right, and a lack of initiative on the state's part to just provide basic services, right, and basic decency to people once they've been released from jail in the US. And then very quickly, I want to just bring up just some examples and the African context, right? So we can look in Burkina Faso and look at the story of Yakub Swadago, right, who used this indigenous agricultural technique to stop desertification in the northern part of the country. We could also look at, although very contentious, the Kogleweogo, this local vigilante group that has emerged in response to the state's inability to control the extremism that's kind of taken over much of the country and offer protection to local communities, right? Similarly, you can look at the Bokso women from Cameroon in the 90s and their agricultural, their labor collective, right, which was based on using indigenous agricultural techniques to spur development in their community. And that became a very global project, right? So these are just some examples of not just here, but just kind of like transnationally in thinking about how Black people have had to respond to the absence of a state or a market that can provide them legitimate services, right?
Thank you. Those are really great examples. I will try to build on that by zooming out a little bit, by maybe first ask ourselves the question, or no, let me put it like this. I asked myself the question when I was trying to think about it. The difficulty I have to answer it, apart from the fact that we can actually, we know that the examples are there, because from the simple fact that as people that were not supposed to survive many of these things, we're still here, right? So we know by definition that these things are happening. But I think that it's really important to acknowledge that in the realm of knowledge production, the question that you ask us is part of those things that are systematically being erased in terms of us remembering, that's one thing. But then also those practices that are almost successfully or fundamentally trying to do just that, so that development or life or survival can be about Black people too. Those things are also both physically and materially, infrastructurally being killed off, right? So Takiyah mentioned Burkina Faso. As a more outzoomed example, we have the figure of Thomas Sankara, obviously, where again, there's so many, it's not even about bringing forward heroes or people that were pure in everything that they did. But on the one hand, the fact that I went to overall really good schools in Europe, also because it's quite cheap, whatever. But you know, like you can do the best education you want, but you might not encounter this person in any of your textbooks, even though he could even count as a arguably very successful attempt at fighting in the 80s at the height of all structural adjustment policies and everything, of fighting both that whole system apparatus, speak very clearly about anti-imperialism, and then actually do stuff in his country that really was about all the stuff that we found in the Millennium Development Goals, but then without actually thinking that the insides of those should come from the West, right? So when we talk about literacy, maternal health, all the agendas on gender equality, gender parity, any of these things, but also deforestation, anything you can think of, that was part of some of the programs that he put forward. And he's an example of somebody that was literally killed around these things, right? Obviously, when you touch the global financial system, the way that he was also trying to incite other African leaders to say, this debt that we incurred, so-called, doesn't make sense in the same way that aid doesn't make sense. So let all decide not to pay. It's just an example of to say that once the attempts are either so radical or so successful to actually make developments about Black survival and thriving, the difficulty for us to remember it is not just that we need to forget it, but also those attempts have been actively fought against. So in that sense, I think that's how I would see some of the tasks that we have if we want to engage with global development, but not in a colonial way, is remembering these things and really unearthing them, because they are there, and they are there in the present, in the small examples local examples that Takiyah gave, but also in the huge processes like the tricontinental, I gave the example of Sankara or whatever, but so it's not even that obscure if you want, right? We even have so for me, I have to say it's become a very much an epistemological question almost, apart from all the material examples that we have, and that we are from the get-go very vigilant, or maybe actually we should be drawn to some of the alternatives that in mainstream discourse are being vilified anyway. And again, not to say everything Black people do is a good thing, whatever, like that's really not what it is about. But in the very easy discourses around corrupt African leaders, we know that there are stuff in there that we need to study, not from a place of judgment, first of all, but from a place of what am I looking at? Is there a little grain of counter narratives in here? Is there a potential of anti-colonial alternatives here? Or is it just a pushback, as problematic pushback against racial capitalism in the way that we look at it? And so in my own research, I'm looking at the concept of agachiro in Rwanda. And there are very concrete examples that come from that don't necessarily need to be celebrated per se, but what is fascinating is how people push back against it. So most recently, the Rwandan Development Board decided to take the money that they get from the gorillas and from tourism to sponsor Arsenal football team in the UK. And again, from an anti-capitalist point of view, this is not something that I would say like, wow, fantastic idea, whatever. But what we see that happens around it is the pushback from both Belgian, Dutch, and UK parliaments, but also journalists, where they cannot conceive of a country that they think they are giving money to and helping to somehow subvert this whole thing and say, we're going to use the tourism money that we have to attract more tourism. And so the football players have Visit Rwanda on their sleeve. And so when you listen to the discourses and you read some of the parliament's proceedings, but then also the pushback that come from Kigali, I'm just fascinated by it. And I don't have to be in favor of or against it, but I can see how these pushbacks, or that the space for alternative approaches to survival and life is a real thing. It's, yeah, very long-winded answer to say that I think it's a really good question, but it's not just one that we can only answer empirically. It's also trying to think of how come we know so little, and how come the more mainstream version of development remains so dominant. And I think part of the answer is in what I said. Yeah.
I'm going to conclude with one final question because I want to open it up to other questions that the attendees are providing. So with all the discussion on global development, I want to know, is there anything about global development studies that can be redeemed, especially if we take into consideration Black Lives Matter and other racialized bodies like Indigenous peoples and others?
I would say that the first version of the global development, like the mainstream dominant one that we talked about, I think it would be helpful if we addressed it or approached it in abolitionist terms to make space, rather than trying to redeem left and right stuff. Because if we're honest, there's like post-development, but also other critical strands of development studies. We cannot say that people have not tried to better this, right? So it's also, and I try not to be completely dismissive or nihilistic about this. For me, this is I'm trying to have that be a very generative move to say, what happens if we could actually conceive to get rid of the whole thing? In terms of what the UN is supposed to do, it doesn't do it clearly. And again, it sounds quite broad brushy, but I think at least in our minds, it will open up spaces to think about this radically different. And for me, I have to say that the latest iteration of the Black Lives Matters activism, where the call to abolish policing or defund the police has really helped me understand what I meant myself when we say, let's get rid of development studies, right? It's not about getting rid of genuine desire to live with each other in a better way. Like, this is how I try also to approach my students when they roll in undergraduates and literally wanting to go to Africa to help people. This is not something we can be cynical about. And I have to fight it sometimes because I know what that means, what the package is that we supposedly offer. It's horrendous, right? But if you try to distill a genuine attitude, particular attitude of being in the world and contributing to other people's life, then you know that the task is more than just say, let's get rid of it. But I think abolitionism has always been about more than just getting rid of stuff. It's about making space for thinking radically different things. So sometimes I try to make it more concrete by saying what would happen both to the institution, the flows of money and everything, if we would change our degrees of international development into global justice and reparations. I think we would attract different students. We would need different scholarship. We might be small programs to begin with, so it's a lot of money that is at stake, we know this. But I do think that it's something that we generally need in the present, and that would allow us to not have this artificial binary between the international and the local. Because when we think about peoples and where they are in the world and how they contributed to history, we know that everybody's everywhere, more or less, right? So then that distinction between inner city London and going to Africa somewhere to do something becomes a much more difficult distinction to maintain. So I would say, let's try to think of when it comes to the discipline, to create a discipline that attends to people living together. I don't think we need, and also slightly less abstract, that attends to that question in the context of the history that we've had and the present in which we are at the moment, right? So in that sense, in short term, I'm still teaching international development studies, but inside, and not talking about it too loudly, but inside the different modules that exist, we try to, for instance, have this different point of origin that Takiyah was speaking of before. I start in first year undergrad in 1492 now. And we have a module that is called The Making of the Global South. We need to know how we got where we are to even try and participate in this, abolition of international development studies. So that would be my stance. Let's not try to redeem the thing that we have now, but let's try to redeem the most honest aspects of it in relation to the possibility of life of those that were not supposed to survive. And I think that's both that's very much a global issue, but also very much a next door neighbor issue. Thank you.
Yeah, I would completely agree with that. And I really like the idea of replacing it with this, with justice and reparations, right? But I would certainly agree with Olivia in saying that dominant strands of development are rooted in colonial matrices of power, right? Their whole entire existence and reason for being is to sustain and perpetuate and further through a particular type of empirical violence, the colonial matrices of power, right? And so to ask whether or not there's something redeemable, I think we have to question whether or not this world is sustainable, right? And to the extent that we could accept that this world is not sustainable, then I think, as Olivia said, we have to not just imagine, but actively practice the abolition of dominant discourses of development. And in that abolition, find ways to also lean into the spaces that have already been doing the decolonial work, right? That have already been doing the radical work, right? And so and we already know this is not just a question of aid, right? So we know Dambisa Moyo's dead aid, where people can propose, right, like getting rid of aid while replacing it with different forms of capitalist production, right? That don't really get at the heart of why we have so much inequality and inequity in the first place. But more thinking again in lines with like Ramon Grossfogel in the decolonial school, even the post-colonial school, which I have some contentions with in the way that they kind of think about tradition in this very static form, or like global movements in a static form that can't really accommodate change. But I do think there's something there in the way that the post-development school also gets at the discursive space, right, that is development, right? So it's not just about institutions, but it's also about the discourses themselves. And so in thinking about this project, and I really like this, because this is something to actively think through, is how do we abolish all forms of the development, this dominant form of global development, not just in terms of like the scholarship, but all of its discursive machinations, right? And so I really like that, and also finding ways to lean into the spaces that are already doing that work. So one of the things I find is that in the moments when it becomes important to highlight, right, and to put forth the work that people have been doing for a long time, the people who are being kind of abolished or being, where their positions of power are in question, come to kind of co-opt, right, what those critical spaces and the people that have been doing this work for a long time have been doing. And then it just becomes this very vicious cycle, right, where it's like now you're using the language of solidarity and sustainability, and but it's absolutely not in the spirit of what it was intended to do. And so being intentional as well is in the process of like abolishing it, but protecting those spaces, right? And again, and part of that protection being like the full leaning in and kind of raising up the people who've already been doing that work, right? So that's a long way of saying that I do not think there's anything redeemable about global development studies in its hegemonic form. And there's plenty of scholarship, viable, important scholarship that's situated outside of that, that we could be giving primacy to and focusing on as development scholars, right?
Thank you to both of you for this really, really insightful conversation. And I think that question has generated a lot of conversation in the chat, where a lot of people seem to be focusing with all of you on not redeeming it and thinking of this idea of reparations and justice to move forward, and thinking of providing the space for fellowships and teaching. So I think that's really, really good. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to move forward to the questions that a lot of the attendees have provided. And to the attendees, if you would like to say your question, just let me know in the chat, and I'll give you permission to speak. That way you can also vocally say it if you don't want to type it. The first question that I want to start with here is, Kasum, I believe, says that I completely agree with the statement made in the webinar. The international development and aid is a continuance of colonial system of governance. How do we get NGOs to truly understand this when they unknowingly suffer from white savior complex? How do we get them to understand that locals have more knowledge than us and that they should be represented in the board of directors and executive management? And this is something that you were both touching on with this idea of like not redeeming global development. So how do we tackle that, right? How do we approach this idea of white saviorness in NGOs, and what can we do to kind of with this? Takiyah, if you want.
Okay, you were breaking up a little bit towards the end, but I think I can see the question, so I'm gonna assume what you were asking is.
Yeah, just based on the question. I was just reading out the question.
Okay. And so, yeah, I think this is important because it gets at, I think the first question is to ask is, why do we need NGOs, right? It's instead of thinking necessarily from the position of how do we get the people working in NGOs to understand that there's a white savior complex, but think about how that white savior complex is embedded in the DNA of the NGO itself, right? And why there's a need for an NGO in the first place, as opposed to looking at what are the, as we've talked about here, right? What are the alternative formations of community development and service provisions that exist beyond the NGO model, right? And so I think that to shift the question, if I can, to thinking about that, right, beyond getting NGOs, it's kind of like the question of development, right? Like, how do we get development to be less violent when it's just embedded in the way that it's come into being, instead of like, what are the alternatives that we can put forth, or what are the alternatives that exist? When then I think there are already numerous examples of locally spaced formations of service provision and accountability, right? Like to hold the state accountable, to hold the market accountable, that exist in these different spaces beyond what the NGO can provide.
Yeah, I wanted to answer the NGO question, and I think for any questions that we will have, if we manage to be able to answer the question why we would want to, like Takiyah was saying, why we would want to redeem or save them, if you have a good answer for that, then you can follow on from that. But the way that you answer this well is, how would you manage to answer it if you do not center the people that are the Western NGOs at the moment, or let's say without Western whiteness or their feelings, and this is something that we also often see in the race and racism debates, is how we continue to center the feelings of well-intended white people in terms of how they have to navigate the fact that we might actually be asking for a radical different reality, right? Where they might not be at the center of it. So that's the sharp part of my answer. But then trying to answer this constructively, and I'm always wary also in Belgium when people ask me to comment or give advice to NGOs in that sense, because it's a difficult conversation. And the first thing that I would want to say is that you cannot have this conversation truthfully if you're not willing to imagine your own, the secession of your own existence as an NGO in the way that you do. So when I try to accept that they might be willing to think about that, again, we need to go to the essence of what the NGO is supposedly to stand for, right? And if it is standing in solidarity with people far away, then depending on where you're located, how the financial structure is of whatever you're doing, it does not mean that you cannot do anything, right? And I give sometimes a concrete example of, let's say, the Ebola crisis, where, you know, obviously it would be very cynical to say, let's blow up the whole system, people are dying, let's not send medicines, or let's not send doctors or whatever. That's not even the point. But if we dislocate the whole understanding of what's happening, then we know that people are not dying because of the disease, but because of the context in which they incur it, geographically, but also historically. So then for NGOs to think that they are doing a good job by just sending doctors and medication, where it's a perpetuation actually, or literally a Band-Aid on a situation that they willingly or unwillingly continue to perpetuate, right? But there is still so much space left for Western actors to be in solidarity in terms of global health with people in the global South. And that might actually mean staying literally where you are and lobby your own parliaments. You do not need to go to Africa for that, right? So there are many different ways in which you can do that, but it requires them to imagine that them, first of all, might not be necessary or might be harmful. So it's about a radical questioning of one's presence, financially, epistemologically, physically in a place, and then backtrack why you wanted to engage with a place in the first place, and then see where you're going to be most useful. So in my research, I've tried to think about this anti-colonial solidarity from a North-South perspective as an imperative to think of dignity that I mentioned before, reparations or repair. But then lastly, also something to do with retreat, because we have been over-imposing ourselves all over the planet. So it means we need to, take a step back. And that doesn't always mean literally, but maybe let's start there first of all, because that's the only way to destabilize it. So yeah, repair, dignity, and retreat is something that I find useful to think this whole abolitionist idea around, because it's not just not caring about it and say, oh, let's just, let it go. It's about how do I redefine the historical responsibility that I have in the present.
thank you for these provocations from both of you. I've just got my mind reeling, and I'm thinking about CARICOM. I'm from the Southern Caribbean, and I'm thinking about, you know, we've had countries that have been trying to push for financial reparations, literally, and they haven't been taken seriously. And I see that in a way as a kind of like further assassination of, you know, like the actual work that people in the South are doing to try and make right some of the gross harm of development. So I'm wondering, you know, like, could we be thinking about mobilizing some of these ideas from Sankara, from Rodney, who were killed before their time, in terms of helping people, whether in our classroom, understand really the essence of what reparations are about? Because I feel like anytime we talk about reparations, white people in particular, but people in general, really don't understand what is going on with reparations.
Now, great question. So I always feel a bit limited myself to answer that question because I'm not a political economist. And sometimes I wish I was like literate in numbers, right? But with what I have in my mind, I try to, Ajay, like you were saying, is something that we need to, as educators, we have a huge platform to make those thoughts thinkable. And I know when I went to uni, reparations was not thinkable, right? Whereas now, and I have to say again, Black Lives Matters allows a lot of that thought even to come into the mainstream. And I'll give the example of Belgium now, just now after I finish this. But one of the ways in which that I try to address it is usually reparations is unthinkable because people know that there is no financial calculation or sum that would actually ever amount to a repair. And then the other realization is that if even we try to approximate it, the whole racial capitalist system kind of would implode, right? And so even in economic disciplines, whatever, there's relatively little work, I have the impression, that is being done in trying to even conceive of that. So then I think it's useful to bring in the historians that they can actually point at moments that we've done reparations. So we have made a place like Haiti pay until the 20th century, pay back their own freedom, right? So, or we have examples, I think, in terms of Second World War, Germany towards the Jewish people, Switzerland as well. There's so many ways in which reparations have happened in the direction we want and in the other direction as well. So it's not about not being able to calculate something. And it's also maybe not about having the right calculation because we know nothing can ever be paid back. So that's why I often try to make a distinction between reparations as an economic calculation on the one hand and repair as a moral or an ethos, a moral standpoint, where you start to understand that a concept like aid has no space in North-South relations today, because if you think of it in terms of repair, you literally dislocate the center of power on who's going to decide who's going to give money to whom for what are the times, the sequences, and any of these things. And again, it needs a shift because the first objection that people would come with would be like, but can we be sure that the money would arrive in the right place because of all these corrupt leaders and all of that, right? So it just shows that we would fundamentally shift how we teach about these places for these ideas as imaginations even to be able to land. But as a way of encouragement, I think if I've been teaching development now for the last 7 years, even in the conversations with my students, I see a shift. But then in literally the last 3, 4, 5 weeks in Belgium, we had 60 years after the date, the Belgian king for the first time expressing regret for what happened during colonial times, Belgium to the Congo and Rwanda, Burundi, parliamentarian commission that is being set up in, like, they do it very badly and it's really fast. They're putting together this expert group or whatever, but in the text, the text that actually starts this whole commission thing, they say they want to investigate everything and reparations are part of that. They're going to investigate which are the families, the current day families that are still benefiting from the spoils, but also the different Belgian institutions and so forth. I'm not going to say that I'm very hopeful that this will be done properly, But I found it remarkable that mainstream Belgian society is using the language of reparations in a very literal way. So yeah, I say a lot of negative stuff, but this was an encouragement thing. I think we underestimate sometimes the power that we have to make things thinkable. It's not even about convincing people, but just making it thinkable and putting it on the agenda.
Yeah, I would agree with a lot of that. But I think I come to the conversation around reparations as being situated in a very myopic understanding that's framed by capitalism, right? And so in thinking about it in purely financial or pecuniary terms, it ends up, even if there were to, and even where we've seen instances where money was actually handed out to like survivors from different systemic acts of violence, is to think about how this still kind of bleeds in and reproduces capitalism, right? Because there's a consumptive element to it, right? Where the money that we give you back is just going to go back into the capitalist system and just kind of maintain itself, right? And so yeah, exactly. It's a very vicious cycle that also does not account for the ways in which we need to think about reparations for the earth, right? We need to think about a form of like earth justice in the way that Vandana Shiva and Julie Livingstone put forward, because again, this world is not, it's not sustainable, right? Like thinking about reparations only in terms of money still reproduces capitalism in its very insidious and unsustainable forms, right? And so when we kind of like expand our imagination and expand the possibilities of what reparations look like that conform with the alternative worlds we're trying to put together, then I think we can, then there's no kind outside of just the clearly racist, you know, we just don't want a radically different world. It's a very hard argument to counter, right? So again, if we think about what does it look like to offer reparations to Pachamama, right? Or to offer reparations to the earth from indigenous perspective. And I like very much what Olivia was saying before about recentering the locus, right? Or the position from which we think about reparations less as modern capitalist subjects, right? But from perhaps like an indigenous perspective, right? Or from somebody who's situated outside of, from a Zapatista perspective, right? What does it look like to garner reparations from those positions? And I think then we could have a radically different conversation that precludes the possibility of saying there's just not enough money. We know there's enough money, right? Like Jeff Bezos just garnered like $360 billion, right? Just this week. We know that capital in circulation is not the problem, but when we situate it in that pecuniary framework, it allows that argument to resurface as a legitimate pushback versus again, reconfiguring reparations from a different epistemological framework, I think can preclude all of those types of kind of pushbacks beyond just blatantly saying we're racist and we want to destroy the earth.
I have to agree. Like, I think changing the locus of enunciation, like, really allows us to think about this differently and recenters people who've always been ignored or silenced or erased. So thank you so much to both panels for highlighting that. I'm going to draw on Rahil's question that says, that touches more on this idea of white saviorism with being about Western NGOs and their Western workers not understanding their paternalism and questioning how unconscious it is. And this person finds themselves asking, what will Europeans be without their humanitarian NGOs? So truly though, what would they be without their humanitarian NGOs?
You know, this honestly makes me think of the great novelist Toni Morrison, rest in power. When she was doing this now famous interview and she says, she talks about like, you know, white people, where would you be without your white privilege, right? You would just be, you would be nothing, right? And so that the problem of race in America is a problem for white people, right? It's a problem that white people have to deal with. And this question really makes me think about that, because to remove NGOs as a formation of white privilege, kind of as Olivia had mentioned earlier, requires then white people or Europeans to grapple with the problems of underdevelopment, not as a problem for the global South, but as a problem for Europe, right? As a problem for how Europe came into being, how they became European in the first place, right? And so my initial response, and just kind of thinking about that off the cuff, is it's very much to remove NGOs would, I think, I mean, unless they come, you know, being very innovative, right? You just come up with a different name for it, right? But if we're talking about removing it and not allowing there to be like a replacement with some new form of, you know, service delivery and, you know, white surveillance in the global South, well, then it forces them to very much have to reconcile with how underdevelopment within, again, capitalist, modernist development is very much a question or a problem for Europeans and not for the global South.
Yeah, I would even add to it. I think most of my attempt at radical thought doesn't even come from development studies, clearly, for the reasons that we gave. But I got a lot of the ideas from anti-racist, anti-Islamophobic activism in Belgium, for instance, right? So it's almost like, I don't even remember when it was, but when you have the epiphany that the whole discourse of assimilation and integration, the social sector that we have locally, right? So for instance, if you are a first generation migrant, you have to do classes in Dutch in Belgium, or you have to do this or that, or the way that you're treated, or the services that are even offered to you, the same paternalism that we see in the global South are happening locally as well, right? So I think it would be useful to try and think of the idea of paternalism as not just something that happens in a literal global North, global South thing, but it is a technology of whiteness and civilizational Western centrism, any of these things, right? So I cannot even say that it's not about whiteness as well, even if it happens locally, let's say in Belgium or in the UK. But I think also if we go back in history, it's the same things that has been happening against how we manage the technologies to manage people in poverty, poor people that, you know, like all the so if we look at it like that, then I think that, especially again as educators, the task is to teach or to write about the connection between a desire for a status quo, and in our case it is racial capitalism, and how the most benign aspects of our society, those that do the social services within the global North, let's say, and those that work for NGOs in the global South, or transnational ones, or the whole aid sector, the sector that helps so-called helps other people, it will need beyond just because the paternalism is obviously a technology of the status quo as well. It will need to answer the question, to what extent are they contributing to more of the same? Or to what extent do they want to align what they think they're doing with an actual change of how things are? And the sad thing is for NGOs that if they are successful, they're not needed. And I think that is the biggest problem, or why they keep on popping up and reinventing themselves in different words. And it's that apparently once you set up something, everything you will do is to keep it in place. And that's the tragedy of NGO, or like not solidarity work, but philanthropy, any of this nice work, so-called, is that if you're successful, you're supposed to disappear, but it's not a natural, you need to be very purposeful about it, because the natural course of thing would be that you keep on reinventing the need for your presence. And that I think we need to get rid of. But it helps if we try to look for similarities in different places, so that it's not just the missionaries that became NGO workers, because that's just depressing in and of itself already, but that we see it as a larger human condition in which we do not see how we can radically think of ourselves as being useful for others without centering our own magnanimousness, if that's the word, but like, because so that's how I see it's very fraught to start with. So that sector needs to be extra vigilant, I think, in imagining their own not disposability, but successful means you need to disappear as an organization. So
we're getting rid of global development and NGOs. I really love the way this is going. And that leads to my final question. So I'm going to shift the focus here because I really want us to think about all these things in a positive frame. So I want us to conclude with this question in mind. How do Black movements and Black Lives Matter specifically, how can we see them working in solidarity with other movements, whether domestically or internationally, to advance collective liberation? Because I think that's what we're all here for. So if we could talk about this idea of collective liberation, especially because we've been talking so much about drawing on Indigenous scholarship.
So I can answer if that's okay. I can start.
Yeah, you can start. Go ahead.
Yeah, so this is a really important question. And so thanks for asking it. I think this is another example that we can talk about, again, from historically, the historical context, and then the contemporary context and the current moment, right? So we can think back to, for example, Pan-Africanism, right? And the Pan-African Congresses, right? That started in 1900 as an act of solidarity, global solidarity for all peoples of African descent to come together and have a shared sense of collective governance and solidarity, right? It's again, as early as the 1900s. We can also think of whether in practice it was super problematic, but at least the theory, right, of like the UNIA, the United Negroes Improvement Association under Marcus Garvey, right, which was an attempt to think diasporically about the position, the economic position of people of the African diaspora at that particular time, right? There was Trans-Africa Forum in the 1980s, right, which prompted the divest and anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. So I think historically there are numerous examples of transnational solidarity movements that have worked from both the economic standpoint, the political standpoint, and the cultural social standpoint. More recently, though, if I can talk a little bit about my own experience with the recent protest from this summer in June and going out protesting with local organizations, one of the things I found fascinating was that it offered a moment of what I'm calling translocal solidarity around state-sanctioned violence, right, which has become in a pandemic as well, right? Everywhere we look in the world, there's this, we see the rise of state-sanctioned and militarized violence, right? Especially against protesters as we further entrench anti-democracy, right? And so the protesting that I was doing in June in the wake of the George Floyd murder, one of the things that I thought was fascinating was how the techniques that the protesters were using here, that we were using here against tear gas, the police beatings, right, were coming directly from conversations with organizers and protesters in Hong Kong and in Palestine, right? So the tactics that they were using against tear gas and how to kind of maintain a sense of protection and these different tactics for dealing with state-sanctioned violence in light of while protesting were directly implemented here in Charlotte, right? And there's just this like beautiful exchange, even though again under these very I don't even want to say unfortunate, right? But these I guess necro-political circumstances, right? But still the act of being able to relate, right, to how this state-sanctioned violence is not just at the national level, even though we use the word state to kind of situate it in that framework, but it is very much a global pandemic, right, that various communities are experiencing and have developed tactics to. So I just wanted to bring that up as an example of like this kind of translocal solidarity, one historically, these different formations, but also today, and how protesters are talking with protesters in Hong Kong and Palestine. There's also been connections with what's been taking place in Brazil, right, under Bolsonaro, right? It's just been a very heightened moment for transnational solidarity, I think.
Yeah, I think it actually follows up from some of the things we were saying before, that there is again this danger of us having forgotten all the historical, but also very much the micro, slightly larger present day solidarities, because again, the way, and when I say the knowledge system or knowledge business is created, is for us not to see these things, right? So that's one thing. Another thing that I would want to bring in again as a caution, is that it's really important not to underestimate another technology of coloniality, which is divide and conquer, right? And that is something that we see happening in the most insidious ways. And often the outside of that is very difficult to perceive. It happens when people say that we reduce everything to identity politics. It happens when, for instance, in Belgium, the Muslim communities pitched against the LGBTQ plus activism. A lot of it is, again, it's a bit like the way that racism works, and I think Toni Morrison also said, a lot of it is distraction, and a lot of it is also materially grown situations from history that have kept us apart, right? So a very concrete example is, I said in Belgium, for instance, now, the parliamentarians woke up, they went to march for the whole Black Lives Matter thing. So that's an example of a transnational, transversal thing that we've seen happening this summer. Something happens in the US, and all the different communities in Europe and in Belgium specifically, they find both rage and solace in that happening to then congregate around similar issues, even though they're slightly different, in a very particular Belgian context, right? So that we see happening, and everybody's surprised because a lot of well-meaning progressive white people join the thing. And so what then comes out of it is people scrambling around to get ideas to make this concrete. So in the case of Belgian Parliament, this commission that they're setting up, it's a handful of parliamentarians, and then they are compiling this group of experts to do this work of truth and reconciliation. The problem with this expert group was that it has become a device of divide and conquer, in which experts are only understood as academics, and we know how problematic academia in general is, right? So they're gonna go to a history and get the truth out of it, even though everybody knows the truth so we don't even need to do that. But what happens is that for the statues that came down, whatever, the only colonial question that they address after the Black Lives Matter thing is the Rwandan, Burundian, and Congolese communities in Belgium, because that's where they had a real formal colony. But if we turned it around, and that was gonna be, my last and more constructive point, I think for us to think in terms of transnational, transversal, or any of the other coalitions, it's always been successful when we understand that our conditions are shared, rather than organize around our different groups and our particular circumstances, right? So understanding that whatever people are doing in Hong Kong is gonna be useful in the streets of Baltimore, it makes sense if you focus on, I'm being gassed by, the state at the actual moment. And so when I tried to turn this around in the Belgian case, so I was asked to be in this expert group, and I refused. And in the letter that I wrote, I said, the reason amongst other also that I refuse is that if we look at the consequences of colonialism in Belgium, it includes all the other communities as well, because racism today is mostly also manifested through Islamophobia, especially against brown men in Belgium, but also the more recent communities and the whole refugee crisis. All of it is part of the same. But now we're gonna focus for 1 or 2 years on this almost random 3 countries that we colonized from a very limited understanding. And then people within the communities, because there's also different wars between the countries at the moment in Central Africa, is that people come out of this saying, you see, we tried, but they don't even agree amongst themselves, whatever, and mostly because everything needs to go really fast. So I guess that would be my point in terms of, and I also saw there was a question about South-South cooperation, and it's the same. There is no virtue or salience in and of itself from non-white people doing stuff. We still need to answer the extent to which we're doing anti-colonial work and pushing back to the actual core of the matter. So in that sense, South-South cooperation can be seen in that sense, to the extent to which it does that work or the extent to which it reproduces it, but then with brown bodies. But very much let's try to be extra vigilant for anything that is divide and conquer. And that goes for all the identity markers, whether it's about how we look, any of the other things that all the different places which people have tried to come together around. Intersectionality has been trying to do this, it's been used in a very identitarian way sometimes as well, but in and of itself, trying to think through that, for me, the most useful is to first try and think, who are they trying to divide? And then push back against that. And there is stuff that you discuss indoors and discuss that you just come out and do publicly. Like it's not a problem. But having the idea that that coloniality is somehow sparing some and not the others, that's its biggest lie, actually. It's that's not how it works. Long-winded answer, but this is what I wanted to say.
Yeah. Okay, thank you to both of you. Okay, I know that there is another question that's come up, so I'll bring up the question and then give you each maybe a minute or two to just give us your concluding thoughts and perhaps address the question if you want to as well. So to draw on the question, Michael asked, recognizing that the Global South obviously is a very generalized term, but just ask that the extent to which whether Global South to Global South learning provides an alternative paradigm that can be seen as more effective. And that's something that I think you were also touching on earlier. But that's something that you can draw on and just provide us both with your concluding thoughts on, I guess, steps moving forward or what we can do to think about global development and Black Lives Matter, or not thinking about global development, just thinking about Black Lives Matter, not a racialized body.
Exactly.
Olivia, if you want to go ahead, you can go ahead.
Yeah. So I very briefly said something about South-South cooperation. So I would reiterate that it's important that we center what we do when we talk to each other as racialized peoples, let's say, or previously colonized places people, rather than, again, trusting that just because we were previously colonized, we have all the solutions. And so for me, it's a bit like when we talk about diversity, representation, all these things. One needs to be wary when panels, when all the corridors of power only contain white men, for instance. But one cannot think that the work has been done when we have the Benetton formation of all the different colors of the world and all the so there is a minimum condition that if there is an absence of diversity, there's something is wrong. And so in the same way, I would say, if all cooperation is only conceived of as North-South, we know that already that doesn't exist, but we know that there is something seriously missing. But it's not sufficient to say, look, this is South-South cooperation, hence by definition is going to be better. So a minimum condition, but not a sufficient one. So then if we want to turn to a sufficient one, that's where we need to foreground the extent to which the relationship is at the service of an anti-colonial alternatives, or alternatives to racial capitalism, for instance. And so we know from experience that not all examples of South-South cooperation that we have today actually stand for that. So in that sense, we can critically address them on those terms. At the same time, though, we also know that the best examples of anti-colonial collaboration come from these transversal corporations, historically and also in the present. And I think, for instance, very concretely of Robbie Shilliam's book, The Black Pacific, where he brings together found cosmology from West Africa to Rastafarianism, both in Ethiopia and the Caribbean, to New Zealand and the Maori people, through Black Power thought that is then situated somehow in the Americas, right? It's a very transversal understanding of corporations, both in the present world, but also transcendentally, that we can bring together to imagine these different types of collaboration, but it's not an automatic one. But what is clearly distinct from that work that I just cited is the fact that it addresses coloniality. It is anti-colonial. So I do think that I would be in favor of investing more in trying to understand the possibilities, but also the things that already exist of this type of transversal corporations that inscribes itself in an anti-colonial ethos. And that would, for me, be about centering life and not centering power. So it's not about the tables are turning now it's the turn of China and India to do whatever. But at the same time, I also think we create breathing room if we stop having the West at the center of the whole of reality. So that would be more or less the way I address it. So yeah, Enrique Dussel calls it the difference between will to life and will to power, or will to live and will to power. In very abstract terms, that for me would be the dividing thing, or yeah, the difference that we can draw. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm thinking about this question a lot, and or both parts of the question. So the first part in whether or not it's the global South-South learning and innovation is a transformative subject of study. And I'm thinking about the recent book that came out, the Routledge Handbook on South-South Solidarity, right, which thinks about this by dislodging South-South from a geopolitical context and thinking about it as a kind of, as an ontological space, right? As an ontological space that kind of reproduces a particular matrix of coloniality, right? And particular power dynamics. And so when we do that, we can see how China using the language of South-South solidarity to further its development aims with Africa, as H.L.T. Kwan talks about in Savage Developmentalism, is a false usage of South-South solidarity, right? Like that language that comes out of like the Bandung Conference, right? Because of what position China once was in, right? And so I think that there's that, right? And dislodging it from the kind of geopolitical notions of what the South means and thinking about it more as like these particular spaces, right, that demonstrate and highlight these power dynamics. And then I wonder, I mean, with the second question, to the extent whether it offers an alternative paradigm, it really makes me think about something I struggle with in my own work, and about how, what is it about seeing movements and the work people are doing on the ground as academics, and the need to constantly like extract from that, right, for our own kinds of like professional ends, right? And so I'm thinking about like, can this work exist on the ground as an alternative in and of itself, without the kind of the epistemic violence that comes with constantly needing to like find these places, extract from them, and to extrapolate to something larger, right? And this is something I think about myself, and so I think this is a really great question for us to think through, because to the extent that we can have genuine community with these kinds of alternatives, right, with these formations as they exist on the ground, and that relationship is reciprocal, then I think there's something there possibly about working with and using a kind of research methodology that is reflexive and accountable to people on the ground to kind of generate some theory. But to the extent that it's not rooted in that practice, then I think that in and of itself tramples on the underlying logic of South-South solidarity, right? That you were actually trying to think about as an alternative paradigm. So even from the research perspective, I think it's important to think about are there ways for us to leave these communities and these organizations alone to do their work and not always seize upon it as something to be extracted from the academy? And then are there ways for us to foment genuine relationships, right, with these organizations and find out ways to perhaps talk about it in ways that make sense to them and are useful for them and accountable to them, to think about it as an alternative paradigm, if that makes sense.
Okay, thank you to both of you for being here. We really greatly appreciate it. The Global Development section of the International Studies Association is honored to have you here, and thank you to all the attendees for taking time from your Sunday to be here with us.